Okay, we're going to move on to the next session, and we're going to draw on a really rich example of how sport in various forms can play a significant and lasting role and have an impact on people in very many different ways. I want to tell you a little bit about DC Scores. You may know a lot about it. 25 years old, it's been around a good while now, and it's been doing some extraordinary things over that time. I'm going to read you the mission for DC Scores. It's creating neighborhood teams to give youngsters confidence and skills on the playing field, in the classroom, and in life. And the vision that attaches to that is the vision of a world where every child experiences the joy of childhood, no matter their circumstances. They've been putting on poetry slams for the best part of 20 years as well, to great acclaim, I should say. And we'll have the CEO of DC Scores, Bethany Henderson, joining us in one of our panel sessions a little bit later. But what better way to illustrate what they do than getting a chance to savor it and get a flavor of it for ourselves. So I'm delighted to say that Maya Smith is with us. Maya is an alum of DC Scores, but pointedly, she is an undergraduate here at Georgetown University and is going to slam for us. Maya, where are you? Here we are. It's over to you. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction. Once again, my name is Maya Smith. I am a senior in the School of Foreign Service. Thank you. I am currently studying culture and politics. I'm concentrating in ecology and fine art, so I'm studying the intersections of how performance, media, communications can be used to communicate environmental discourse and social discourse. I am an alumnus of the DC Scores program. I participated when I was in elementary school. And doing DC Scores as an elementary school child in Ward 7 of Washington, DC, was my first introduction into sports, but also into arts. And so if it weren't for that formidable experience I had in my youth, I might not be on the stage today. And so I want to express my gratitude. I prepared a couple pieces for you all, pieces that I've written over the years. I'll save you the headache of angsty teen, young adult poetry. It won't be all of it. So these first two pieces I've written or I wrote in high school. Wonderland. Love is the potion bottle that says, drink me. And just like Alice, we do. We find ourselves in a wonderland, too busy running towards red hearts to realize what is happening. We say we love and think it is, and like the heart, we are ripped open and made love to. We sit wondering how we could have been so naive to follow the rabbit down the hole in the first place. We want to leave, but unlike Alice, we are kept under, and we've been drinking drink me's ever since. Dark money. Dark money and funny games. Evil stuff drives me insane. Poor people, open your eyes, but you wake and bake to American lies. You sit in a haze of Prozac-induced peace, resting passive, death to caprice, and you cry your complaints. You have no right. Lions release, no sleeping tonight. Devourer of freedom, our eagle is dead. So we die inside. Too many lies. Dark money and American pride. This next piece I wrote as a freshman in college. I performed it at Our Words, Our City Poetry Slam with DC Scores, and I think it was in 2016 or 17. And it has since been published with publishers like GU Anthem here on campus and Street Sense Media in Washington, DC. It's titled On the Corner of 16th and Envy. 16th Street Envy. Wish it was me. Ward 7 is where I live. Wish it was Ward 3. That grass sure is green. My side of the city consists of train tracks and strange things. Don't look. Can't you see my hatred is consuming? My side of the city is so goddamn gloomy. Got told in a few weeks the city's ensuring my community displacement, my community foreclosing. It is said from our displacement, they'll house the new people moving into our places. My city, DC, My city against me, a struggle so hard. There is a difference between surviving and living. On 16th, they're living. Potlucks and gala shows. I should know. I was invited to be shown. A reminder of a place that was never home. A reminder of a place I should aspire to go. Because media reminds me I am nothing to society. Only thugs on the street capable of only running. But we've all been running from someone and something. But I've only been running to find what I'm searching. Tell me a place exists where I can call home. A place where no one has to roam alone. A place where hands are stretched to help, where they teach children helping others is truly helping yourself. See, that's the place I'm running to. And when I can't find it, I'll make it come true. I'm setting walls of resilience where I was torn apart, setting stones of foundation, concrete mind for concrete creation. We have got to make it. No more definitions, statistics, boundaries, and titles. No more, you belong here and those are your idols, because I've got ideas and courage and life. And wherever I go, I'll be taking my time. No need to lust and no need to long, because I am where I need to be, in myself, all along. Thank you. This next piece I wrote while I was abroad. I spent my junior year in Germany, Freiburg, studying environmental sustainability, forest management of the Swiss and German Alps. Lots of fun. I enjoyed it a lot. This next piece is titled Sunset and Stars. Once I heard a story about sunsets, that every time the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, it would introduce a deep darkness. But the moon would come and guide it to its resting place in the vastness of space. Every star was actually a pale sun shining in the night sky. It was determined to gift us its rays of light to Earth. I'm grateful to see the sunsets that happen on the horizon outside of my window. The whir of the train passing by on the tracks. It slows down time, where I find myself abroad, witnessing stars in the sky and all that the universe is so familiar, even though I am horizons away from home. And though it can sometimes leave me a bit in the dark, I still find myself surrounded by stars. And this is the last and final piece. It is titled Small Acts. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can change the world. Your action determines that change, be a positive or negative reaction. But nothing is worse than inaction. Inaction is the whisper that tells you don't do. It says you are powerless. It says you do not matter, therefore you should not care. So you let yourself accept a lie, stand unmoving and immobilized. See, inaction is action of fear and control. Let go of that fear, get out of the hole. Our oceans are at stake. Our planet's lungs burn. There is smog in our eyes as plastic waters churn. Animals silently sulk towards extinction. Crisis abroad, all the war and the violence. Social injustice as our nations grow silent. But do not be inactive. The size of the problems do not matter. We know collectively they are great. Big problems need small, effective answers, and that answer is you. Hope says to move. Hope says to listen and know when to speak. Hope says to love both the strong and the weak. Hope says to choose to leave an impact on the world, because the tiniest of murmurs make the largest of quakes. What would you choose if nothing were at stake? If you're going to choose, then join the millions who make the world of tomorrow is only a reflection of today. Use where you are, this school or any place, to define yourselves, to define your own great. Never underestimate the power of one. Your small acts will change your world, so change our world. There is work to be done. Thank you.
Fantastic, Maya. Well done. Terrific stuff. Thank you. What was that last piece called? Maya? Maya? What was it
Small
called?
Acts.
Small Acts. Thank you very much indeed. Have you got any more? We'll have some more. We'll have some more later, I think. That was just wonderful. Inspiring change were two of the words that came up in that last piece in Small Acts. So we're going to go on to our next panel session, which is entitled, how wonderful is that, Inspiring Change Through Major Sports. And once again, I'd like to ask our moderator and panelists to come up and join me, please. Sorry, hi, lovely to see you. Great to see you. You too. Thanks, Val. So let me introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then I will hand over to Val. And again, a quick wave to the crowd to get the right sort of sense as to who's sitting where. Kathy Engelbert, thank you very much for joining us, Commissioner of the Women's National Basketball Association. And Kathy is also the first female commissioner of the Women's National Basketball Association. A basketball and lacrosse player of considerable achievement yourself. CEO of Deloitte, the chair and CEO of Deloitte and Touche, and one of those people who quite clearly puts a fist through the glass ceiling. Thank you very much for being with us. David Grevenberg. David is the CEO of the Commonwealth Games Federation. I'm sure David will explain better than I can, but the Commonwealth Games comes around every 4 years. It has traditionally been known as the Friendly Games. David was in charge of Glasgow 2014, which was acclaimed as one of the great Commonwealth Games. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, David. Previously the Executive Director of Sport and International Federation Relations at the International Paralympic Committee as well. Be careful, he's a former wrestler. Has also been an athlete agent, a coach, and actually, very interestingly, I thought, took the Commonwealth Games Federation General Assembly to Rwanda only a matter of a few weeks ago. David, thanks for joining us. And Paul Tagliabue. Paul, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Paul is the former commissioner of the National Football League from 1989 to 2006, and chair of the Board of Directors here at Georgetown University from 2009 to 2015. Paul also was a very fine basketball player, had an athlete scholarship here at Georgetown University, was team captain 61 to 62, and has been awarded the Eagle Award from the US Sports Academy, which is the highest international honor for contributions to international sport. It is a great pleasure to have you here, Paul. And I have to declare a small interest with Val. Val Ackerman is another driving force behind Sport at the Service of Humanity. She is also, of course, Commissioner of the Big East Conference, the first president of the Women's National Basketball Association, 96 to 2005, and another phenomenal athlete in her own right. I'll use the word phenomenal. You should have seen me, I will tell you. Basketball, field hockey as well, and athletics, and won an athletic scholarship to the University of Virginia. Look, it goes on. It goes on for all of them, as we've said before. Val, I'm going to hand the plate over to you. Inspiring change through major sports. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you all. To put it mildly, it's just an honor to be here today. I'm not often a moderator, so I'm going to do my best here. I've got all my notes together, and I know we're going to have some great conversation here with my colleagues. The most exciting part about this for me, as David noted, is that I've been involved with the SSH initiative since it started back in 2015, and many of my colleagues who are part of that launch effort are in the room. And I want to thank all of them for continuing with this important dialogue and action. And I would especially want to acknowledge President DeGioia and Joe Ferrara and Georgetown and the Vatican for their incredible work here. I have to give a nod, given my current line of work, to how schools like Georgetown really do bring to life all of these words, all of these principles every single day in the way that they marry academics and athletics and spirituality in their quest to develop students and student athletes as whole people. So it's a great honor for me to support their work. I want to recognize Lee Reed, Director of Athletics here at Georgetown, who does this every single day. And so my goal here with this panel is to use our experts here to draw out how major sports organizations and events can use the unique resources and the visibility and the influence that they have to bring these principles, again, to life in their worlds, and at the end of the day, make the world, as we've discussed, a more peaceful and tolerant place. So I've got a series of questions here, and I'm going to start off with you, Commissioner Tagliabue, one of my heroes, and ask you, first I'm going to hit you with a lot of questions, but the first ones I'm going to ask you about are the NFL. So let's talk about, during your time there, how were you thinking about a professional sports league's role and potential to affect positive social change? And in your work there and in the time since, how do you think that mission has evolved? How has your thinking evolved in terms of the ability of the sports league to do that? And then a corollary is how you see players and owners in particular working together effectively to maximize the impact that they can have in serving humanity. So
is that one question?
That's all one question. I wanted to get it all in at the beginning. You can go anywhere you want with it.
Well, I think that the short answer is that sports leagues, professional sports leagues, are in the process of reinventing themselves. They are going beyond their original mission, which is to present sports entertainment. And they are moving into spaces that have to do with major issues in society. And the athletes in particular are moving beyond being athletes to being educators, facilitators, leaders on societal issues. So, and I think the transformation of the leagues is just beginning. Each league is struggling. The NFL is doing it in certain ways. The NBA is doing it in other ways. The NHL is doing it in different ways. Major League Baseball and so on. Each league has its own sort of micro programs, but if you step back and look at all the micro programs, it's transformative. Why is it transformative? I think it's three things. First of all, at least in the NFL and the NBA, the athletes have grown up in segments of society which are suffering and are not equal to other segments of society. So it gets into income inequality, it gets into law enforcement profile, it gets into a lot of issues that the athletes know about because they grew up in those communities and they want to have a voice to rectify those injustices. Secondly, it's resources. When I started working on NFL stuff, which was 1969 as a young lawyer, a typical player might be making $35,000. Today, a typical player may be making $3,500,000, and lots of them are making $10 million or more. And we see that in other sports. So the athletes have resources, they can have staffs, they can have allies, they can partner with other programs and bring resources to the table. That was not the case decades ago, certainly in the years that I was commissioner. The third thing is the platforms that are available. When I left as commissioner in 2006, there were no smartphones. They came on board 6 months later. There was no Facebook. It came on board three months after I left. So we were dealing with traditional media, not with the media that's out there today, not with the technological devices that have created this interconnected society. So when you put those three things together, there's enormous potential for professional athletes, and not just athletes, but coaches and other leaders in professional sports to have an impact on societal issues that did not exist when I was commissioner.
Thanks, Paul. Kathy, I'm going to switch over to you. You, as David noted, spent many years as a senior executive, later CEO at Deloitte, prior to assuming your duties earlier this year with the WNBA. Can you talk about your thoughts framed first, of course, by your experience at Deloitte, now in the professional sports world, on social responsibility as a business imperative.
Yeah, so I think as everyone probably in this audience knows that for corporations now, social responsibility is table stakes. This is something every CEO has seen, the rise of employee activism. Employees want and we have 5 generations in the workforce today, and at Deloitte, we had 100,000 people, 75% millennial, and a rising digital native like Maya, who you heard up here, very, very impressive young woman. And I loved her big problems need small effective answers, because if you think about how you deal with social responsibility as a CEO of a large organization or now as a commissioner of a smaller organization, it is something that is expected. And as Commissioner Tagliabue just said, social media and the ability to have a platform for these athletes or even for an employee of a big corporation can actually go out and either talk to the media or tweet or have something on Instagram or Snapchat that my kids have taught me how to use versus just Twitter. You know, they say I'm behind the times a bit. But, you know, this social consciousness that's out there, and whether it's the UN sustainability, the SDGs, the goals that every company now is being held to, whether it's investors and stakeholders in companies being, you know, demanding, you know, as a stakeholder, demanding the social consciousness of a company. And I just think I've seen an evolution of this over time. And to the WNBA, this is, I think, one of the most diverse league in sports, and certainly is one of the most socially conscious and community-minded. And it's because these women feel they can have an impact in their communities. We had one of the best players, if not the best player in the WNBA, take the year off, Maya Moore from the Minnesota Lynx. She took the whole year off this year to go do ministry around prison reform, and she has taken on a cause with a prisoner on death row who she believes has been falsely accused. We had Natasha Cloud right here in the DC market, who is a huge advocate for gun control. We have a variety of, you know, opioid awareness. We have a variety of social issues that the players want to speak out for or against. We have such a divisive society, and as the commissioner said around sports, I mean, sports is the great unifier. And I think that's probably one of the reasons for, you know, SSH is, you know, how can sports in this very divisive society we live in, you know, be a unifier? But I do think Maya's advice on us, small effective answers. I mean, one of the things at Deloitte as I came into the CEO role 5 years ago, I was like, we're giving to every organization in the world, it seems like, but are we really making an impact? So we actually said, let's pick 2, and we picked education and veterans. And we started a world-class 50 million futures on education, and then veterans, we started a whole program to help veterans transitioning into civilian life and to help them with life skills, because we knew they had the leadership skills to connect them to get their next career.
Great, thanks, Kathy. This might be a good time to interject the anecdote that you and I talked about. You have some pre-existing tie, perhaps, with the initiative through a meeting that you had at the Vatican.
So one of the things as a CEO, you get invited to some really cool stuff, but nothing was cooler than 2 years ago in December when I got invited to the Vatican to meet Pope Francis under the guise of, you know, a bunch of US CEOs coming over to work on education for all, healthcare for all, and employment for all, because if you have a good education and you get a good job, you have good health care, everybody gets lifted in society. So I had the amazing opportunity to meet Pope Francis in a moment at the Vatican, which was, you know, again, to this day, one of the most amazing moments of my life.
Great, thanks, Kathy. David, I'm going to now turn my attention to you for a minute here. Before we get into some of your important work and your plan, I just thought, since our audience may not be as familiar with the Commonwealth Games, as they are with the NFL and the WNBA, I thought maybe you could offer up a brief description of the history of Commonwealth sport and a bit of a preview about your next major upcoming competition, which is going to be in Birmingham in 2022.
Great, thank you. Just to first declare, I am from inner city New Orleans originally, but live currently in Scotland and work in London, and have been away from the States for about 20 years. Let me start with really describing what the Commonwealth is for those of you that may be less familiar with it. Largely, and just in terms of facts, it represents 1/3 of the world's population. So essentially 2.6 billion people comprise of the Commonwealth, 53 countries, 71 nations and territories, 2/3 of the world's small states and island states, and also of that 2.6 billion people, 60% are under the age of 30. Sport largely was introduced in its formality in the Commonwealth through British colonialism. And the Commonwealth, in terms of its shared history, is largely derived from British colonialism. However, over the past almost 80 years, it has gone from empire to movement, and a movement of social change. Through the Commonwealth Charter, which was signed in 1954, it really looks to uphold 4 fundamental ideals of peace, prosperity, good governance, and human rights. And so the Commonwealth Games, which started in 1930 under the guise of the Empire Games, has transformed itself to be the Commonwealth Games. And essentially the Commonwealth has moved from marked as the British Commonwealth to the global Commonwealth. Now that backdrop is quite complex when you put the power of sport and the power of the games and all of that diversity to the smallest nations of Nui, which is literally in the population of thousands, to one of our largest countries, obviously India, of 1.6, and everyone in between. So the Commonwealth Games essentially is the second oldest multi-sport event of its kind, next to the Olympics. And many of the great stars that you have seen or are promoted or debated, from the Caribbean to Africa to the UK, Australia, New Zealand, further afield, sports like rugby sevens, which were recently introduced in Rio, were incubated and nurtured in the Commonwealth Games. So the Commonwealth, whether you've heard of it from an American standpoint or not, you've heard of it indirectly. And so I have the privilege of being the chief executive of the Commonwealth Games Federation, to which we are making sense of all of this, creating a narrative that aligns with brand Commonwealth and not simply using our opportunity to host a major sporting event every 4 years to have just a great party. We essentially are using the brand Commonwealth to drive social change. And we transformed our vision as an organization away from simply just hosting great games every 4 years to, through the power of sport, create peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous communities across the Commonwealth. And that is not just an esoteric group of words. That is actually a continuum that you cannot have sustainable and prosperous communities without peace. And so we've developed an impact model that we drive all of our contracts, all of our programs, all of our games-related activity, and everything in between based on creating peace, sustainability, and prosperity. So
Great.
That's an introduction.
All right, thanks, Dave. And I'm going to come back to you to build out on some of that. But first, I'm going to turn back to Paul. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk to you about your work with RISE. As many of you may know, Paul serves as the chairman of the board of the Ross Initiative in Sports for Equality. And I'll just read here the description of the organization. Many of you have heard of it, I'm sure. It's a national nonprofit that educates and empowers the sports community to eliminate racial discrimination, champion social justice, and improve race relations. So Paul, I want to see if you can sort of educate us a bit on that underlying mission, your current areas of focus now at RISE, and in general, what do you think sports can do to help bridge our country's racial divide and improve race relations across the many sectors of society, sports included?
Yeah, first a few words about RISE. It's a coalition of all of the major professional sports leagues and sports organizations, not just leagues, but NASCAR, U.S. Tennis Association, and so forth. It's not only the sports organizations themselves, but it's the media companies that carry sports, so CBS, NBC, ESPN, and so forth. And they have agreed to come together as a coalition to sponsor programs with athletes at all levels and using athletes as leaders and facilitators, professional athletes, collegiate athletes, and even at the youth level, using coaches and as leaders on issues of race. So what does that mean? As an example, a big focus of RISE and of the NBA and of the NFL and the NHL is the relationship between communities and law enforcement. We all know what generated Black Lives Matter and other organizations, Ferguson, Missouri, and so on, Baltimore. So there's a tension in these communities, in the African American communities in particular, but Hispanic and Latino communities, between the communities and law enforcement. So what is being done about that through RISE? Well, the Rams, for instance, have invested in LA in two football teams in Watts, where the coaches of the football teams are cops. And the Rams coaches and players help the police officers understand how to coach youth football. So it brings kids together with police in an area where it's fun and it's entertainment and it's values, and not where it's stop and frisk or profiling. The NBA has got a program called Building Bridges with Law Enforcement. It's a powerful organization with similar programs. And so that's just a little bit. But with adults, we bring together communities, inner city communities with suburban communities, and talk about who are you? What are you? You're black, I'm white, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean much. Are you a veteran? Are you a parent? Where did you come from? How long have you been in this community? What do you do? Are you engaged in not-for-profits? So RISE our goal is to eventually take this online to scale and reach literally millions of young people through sports on issues of racial justice and bigotry.
Great, thanks, Paul. Kathy, I'm going to come back to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. I know, topic near and dear to your heart. You've shattered many glass ceilings in your career. And my question to you is, how do you think about that? How do you see the ball continuing to move forward, particularly in gender inclusion? And how you see the WNBA in particular as a vehicle to help make that happen?
Yeah, obviously I've hopefully championed diversity and inclusion more broadly, not even just gender, with, whether it's policies you put in place, family leave, male and female, for any family matter, not just maternity leave, paternity leave. And there's a variety of things obviously we can do as leaders, but we are still pushing a big boulder up a hill in women's sports. So now that I've joined women's sports, and I didn't know this before coming in, less than 5% of all corporate sponsorship dollars go to women's sports, and less than 5% of all media coverage of sports covers women's sports. Yet 85% of people surveyed said they like women's sports and they like to watch women's sports, and 80% of all purchasing decisions are made or influenced by women. And so if that's not a good platform to sell, notwithstanding the diversity of a league like the WNBA, where we're predominantly over 80% African American, we've got an LGBTQ community, it's all women, these are the most elite athletes in the world. Another thing, that just amazes me is we're going into the Olympics next year in Tokyo. The USA women's basketball team is going for their 7th consecutive gold medal. Did you know that? And in the 6 gold medals, you know what their record is? 100 wins and 1 loss. It's a dynasty of all proportions, and guess what? Nobody's talking about it. NBC did their 1-year run-up to the Tokyo Olympics even before I started as the commissioner of the WNBA, and guess what? They didn't even mention the women's basketball team. So we're pushing this boulder up a hill, because if that had been the men's team, that would have been the lead story. And so there is a societal issue here that we have around the coverage of our sports, our women's sports. Now, we have this moment in time with the Women's World Cup win. Amazing moment, lift all women's sports. We have this momentum around the WNBA as I traveled around as we finished our 23rd season. Great momentum. And then we have this movement around women's empowerment. And so I've called it the 3 M's. We have this moment, this momentum, and this movement. If we can't capitalize on this to raise not just women in sports, women in basketball, but kind of women in society, Val, this is just an issue that I'm hugely passionate. I have an aspiration to raise all women and women in society, not just women in sports, because I think, again, sports is this great uniter, sports is this great role model for women, and there is no doubt that as an athlete, and I was a huge beneficiary of Title IX in the 70s and 80s and got to play at the college level and had the same treatment as the men at the college level. And so, you know, what's great about Title IX, and I know there's some people who don't agree with Title IX, is it gave opportunity and it gave equal representation in sports for women. But then when you get into the professional ranks, there's a huge drop-off in attendance, in viewership, in media, in household names, in rivalries. And so, you know, my aspiration is, again, to transform the WNBA, but hopefully to actually help lift not only women in sports, but some of these tough societal issues where women don't feel that they can have the confidence. And there's no better place in sports that builds confidence in women and girls. And you see girls who have played sports have huge confidence. I think of the 30 in the Fortune 500 female CEOs, I think 90% of them played sports through the high school level. I mean, there's something there that builds confidence and leadership skills for later in life. And we've got to figure this out and really raise the profile of women in sports and the media coverage.
Great, thanks, Kath. And on this note, I just want to expand a minute on Marie Royce's comments last night before the Georgetown win, and just acknowledge the great work that the State Department, together with ESPNW, have done in creating a global sports mentoring program, GSMP. It's been around for 6 or 7 years, and it involves bringing to our country every year 15 to 20 women from other countries who come here. They spend a month in the US. They do some developmental work at state, and then they're placed with host organizations who offer them some inspiration and insights and some know-how. It's an amazing program. GSMP is the acronym. Encourage everyone to check it out online. But I just want to give a special acknowledgement. We have a delegate this year from Egypt, Abir Assawe. Please stand up. This is my delegate from Egypt who's here, who's an amazing young woman. She is an Egyptian Taekwondo Olympic champion who has started a digital sports network in Egypt, among other leadership ventures. So it's people like this that are going to change the world. So I want to thank State. Trina Bolton is here from State. I want to thank you very much, sitting in the back. So thank you to both of you. David, I'm going to come back to you, and I want to ask you to spend a minute on the important work that you're doing to make the Commonwealth Games, as you said, something more than a competition. You've identified humanity, equality, and destiny, if I've got that right, as among your core values. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how those came into being, your perspectives on that, and what strategies you're using to help bring them to life through the competitions and other programs that you've put together.
So we have those 3 core values that help us have the impact of peace, sustainability, and prosperity. And so those are really collective values versus individual values. Humanity, we value humanity. Equality, we give people access and include them because we value them equally. And destiny, we unleash, unshackle, unchain people's ambitions and aspirations to achieve their destiny. That's the narrative behind those values. And so we're at a crossroads. In 2010, we hosted a Games in Delhi, an emerging market, had roughly 6 years to build an enormous amount of infrastructure, which was probably too short of a time period. 53 people died building venues. The question of narrative around the Commonwealth was challenged quite a bit in terms of its shared history on colonialism and India. And there was no easy response. I happened to be the chief executive of the next organizing committee to inherit that conversation and had to really fundamentally go very deep in terms of changing some of that narrative. So essentially what we have done over the past 8 years is create a narrative focused on how do we uphold those values of humanity, equality, destiny through tangible action. So in Glasgow, we were the first organizing committee to outline our approach to respecting, protecting, and promoting human rights through all of our procurement streams, to how we were actually going to work with inclusion, social inclusion. In some of Europe's poorest neighborhoods, I'm not sure how many of you know Glasgow, but the average life expectancy in the east end of Glasgow of men was 54 years of age. We went out to communities and asked them, what does it mean to be a Commonwealth citizen? To which everyone honestly answered, nothing. So we had a lot of work to do. There was no identity and no sense of belonging to our brand. So we invoked a campaign very focused on active citizenship under the backdrop of a very, very tense reality that sectarianism, religious sectarianism, divides a city through sport. How are we going to unite a city? For those of you that may be less familiar, Catholic-Protestant divide is very, very prevalent in Glasgow. We used, to the colors that we used, to the conversations we had to unite a city. And probably through our opening ceremony, celebrating and addressing issues around the legacy of slavery and how Glasgow benefited from the tobacco trade. We really had to address all of these things, to LGBTI rights advocacy and how we were going to move the dial forward in terms of the criminalization of people across the Commonwealth. So there was a number of issues that we tackled in Glasgow that paved the way for us to move, and one of the probably great accomplishments is that we raised 6.5 million pounds, so about 10 million pounds equivalent, in our opening ceremony, partnering with UNICEF, to which we used over the next 4 years leading up to the next games to support programs that were transformational in 53 countries for children's safeguarding, rights, promotion, and empowerment. So there's a lot of elements that we use through our games to bring awareness, advocate, and take meaningful action that shifts the dial. But it's very contextual. So the games that we ran in for example, Australia, focused largely on Indigenous reconciliation. So that's how we're using, for example, the games to tackle some of the localized but also global issues related to sport.
Great. Thanks, David. Switching gears again, Paul, I'm going to come back to you, but put on another one of your hats here. You served for many years as a member and then later the chair of the board of directors here at Georgetown, which of course is a prominent Jesuit institution of higher learning. Can you talk a little bit about how these values, these principles that the Sport at the Service of Humanity initiative is amplifying, how they're brought to life in the university setting, and what more that you think intercollegiate athletics could be doing to build the character of young people and to inspire positive impacts in the communities in which they're operating.
I think athletics at Georgetown are an integral part of education. Athletics at Georgetown are about accountability, respect, diversity, opportunity, but also what are your priorities? Building an academic record that enables you to be a leader in life. But those things are challenged now, not just at Georgetown, but in all of higher education because of what I would say are three trends that are affecting sports at all levels, including at the university level. And what I'm about to say is probably a little bit contrarian, and maybe I'm agreeing with Paul Eli on some of these things. I think, first of all, we say sports is the great unifier. Is it really? Did Colin Kaepernick unify America? Or did he go to war with Donald Trump? Did the red states go to war with the blue states? It's clearly the latter. Colin Kaepernick was not a unifier. He was painted as an unpatriotic person, anti-law enforcement, anti-cop. So in that particular context, sports is not a unifier. In other areas, what we're dealing with is declining participation in sports and increasing spectating in sports, and calling things sports that, in my judgment, are not sports. We have e-sports. Tell me why that's a sport instead of being a video game. I always thought that sports had something to do with physical endeavor. E-sports, all you get is carpal tunnel syndrome. So the notion that sports is the great unifier and that sports are becoming ever more important in our society, I don't buy into that. I think there's declining participation, increasing spectatorship, and most important of all, inequality of opportunity. Inner city schools do not have sports because they don't have the funding. Suburban schools have pools, road trips, multiple coaches, arenas, and so on. There's an organization called Up to Us Sports. It was created in the wake of the financial crisis. The leader of Up to Us Sports is a Georgetown graduate. It's up to us, their mission is, it's up to us to save sports in inner city America, because tax-supported sports at all levels in the public schools around the country have been gutted. So I think we need to be realistic when we talk about sports as the great unifier. In some contexts, it's the great divider. In some contexts, it's unifying us around issues that everyone is already unified around. And in other contexts, it's a manifestation of the inequality in our society, which creates major, major problems for our citizenry. And I don't want to go into the whole issue of paying people for images and likenesses, what you chaired a report. I don't want to go into paying athletes and should they or should not be paid. But I think that the traditional mission and role of sports at Georgetown is a long way from where it once was. And Jack is a great leader to try to keep it where it is, but I think there's a tidal wave of commercialization that's a real threat to sports as a transmitter of the values we're talking about here at this conference.
Those are very powerful comments indeed, and I think what I would maybe propose, I think we're probably going to start winding down in a few minutes here, but I'd like to ask all of you, and maybe in part in response to Paul's comments here, if the goal, Paul, is to make or restore sports as the unifier, if that becomes the goal, which I think it is, I think that's the goal of this initiative, what can the organizations represented in this room, many of which are smaller than the organizations that all of you represent or have access to, in the case of the WNBA. So what can they learn from the big leagues and the big events as they look to make a difference on a smaller scale? What are the most impactful ways that sports organizations can get to this ideal, this goal? So Kathy, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
I mean, I think, you know, the role models that these athletes represent, because they didn't come from traditional suburban backgrounds necessarily, and some did, and I'm seeing a movement in these, you know, this theory that you can't be what you can't see. Well, when you see a, you know, woman of color athlete at the highest level of the game being paid a fair wage and getting the, you know, what she deserves as far as the coverage, I mean, I think that role model and that ability to have, I mean, you know, we talked about sports as a feeder into the professional leagues, but one of the issues right now is girls are dropping out of sports at an alarming rate by the age of 14. And why is that? There are many things that can diagnose that, but one of them is this year-round, pick one sport, and it's hard. I mean, I played 3 sports in high school, 2 in college, did not play year-round. Think about that. And now they're playing one sport year-round, their bodies are breaking down. I played basketball for 12 years, never had an ACL tear of any of my teammates or myself. And now it's, if you haven't had an ACL tear, an Achilles or something. So there's something kind of wrong with kind of the feeder system into professional sports. But I do think there's a lot of hope and hopefully help that this group can give and this initiative can give around these role models and continuing to elevate them so we lift, again, some of these tough societal issues, whether it's gender gap, whether it's income inequality, that these role models are representing how you can make it in the world and be a role model and ultimately succeed, hopefully post-sports. And hopefully one of the reasons I took this job was to help prepare these women post their basketball life, because I feel I really have something to offer there. And if we can kind of show these role models coming into society, making a difference, whether it's in politics, government, in corporations, in not-for-profits, I think, or in coaching, more diversity in coaching, helpful as well. I think there's a lot of optimism that can come from that.
Thanks, Kathy. Dave, your thoughts, how to maintain sports as a unifier?
Yeah, I think first, sport has to uphold its duty of care. And I think we all have, and whether you're big or small, you have to respect and protect people first. And if you don't, you can protect them but don't respect them. It's really, that's a big issue. And respecting is embracing that diversity, and that's very difficult. It's very, very difficult in terms of getting the right narrative, particularly with the hierarchical structures that sport is governed through, getting a much more egalitarian adhocracy of sorts of approach to governance of sport, I think will combat some of the over-commercialization issue and help us respect and protect. The second staunch is really, once you respect and protect, meet that duty of care, is creating meaningful opportunities. And that is about promotion, equal promotion of men and women, of diversity in terms of race, in terms of perspective and orientation, all of these elements. That's really important, and that's something that's a richness of sport, because it does become more unifying when you show that diversity. And then about empowerment. Empowerment's really about, can we measure this? Can we measure that we've actually shifted the dial and shown that we can be accountable? And so I think that continuum of respect, protect, promote, and empower is something that is a way that we can tackle it. And I think that if we do it smart, we can diversify our revenue streams. I think in the United States, there is a strong, strong focus on private investment, and there's a lot of historical baggage on that. I think we need to be more creative in terms of how we use a much more joined-up approach in terms of public, private, and third sector or nonprofit funding to really have some really positive impact on sport and through sport.
Thanks, David. And of course, implicit in all of that is good leadership going forward, and all of you are great leaders. And so I wanted to just ask you a question on that topic. As many of you know, SSH has created a young leaders mentoring program. I believe some of the mentees are in the room today. And so my question to the three of you, each get a turn here, is to talk about what themes, if maybe there was one thing you think should be front and center as a developmental theme, as we look to build the next generation of both sports and societal leaders. I'm sure that would be of great interest to the audience. So, Commissioner Tagliabue, can I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think programs like that are fantastic, but it's not easy to define how you teach people to be a leader. My own personal opinion is that leadership starts with the values that you get from your parents and from your community when you're a kid. And if those values are fractured or non-existent, then you've got one set of challenges. If those values are solid, then you have real opportunity. But I think, to the extent we can put more and more resources into creating leaders through sports, leaders in society, the better off we'll be. I mentioned Up to Us Sports. What do? They take kids, Up to Us Sports takes young kids who have dropped out of high school, maybe when they're 15 or 16, and now they're 20 or 21, and they've had the dead spot in their life for 4 or 5 years. And they're sitting on a street corner threatened by the drug traffic. And Up to Us Sports takes them and makes them into coaches. They take kids who are 21, 22 years old who haven't had a life and makes them leaders by making them coaches in sports for boys and girls in that same community. That's phenomenal. That's dealing with the reality of what's out there which is leading without resources.
Yeah, maybe I'd say just more characteristics of leaders, whether it's in society or sports. I think in today, and I think it's even in the past 5 years, moved quickly because of expectations of millennials and digital natives is empathetic leadership, so empathy and authenticity. I believe that the next generation of leaders has got to be transparent, authentic, whether it's in sports or elsewhere, because I think that is actually how people will follow and how people will see role models to lead themselves. It's got to be authentic leadership. And again, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have answered the question that way.
Thanks. David, your thoughts?
I have to agree. I think empathetic leadership is really important and the foundation to compassionate leadership. And I think the difference being that empathetic leadership is I can understand what it feels like to be under that rock. Compassionate leadership, whether that's making tough decisions or hard decisions or tough love decisions, is about helping you lift that rock off someone. And so I do think combined with empathy as a young aspiring leader, learning how to empathize, learning how to respect and listen and learn before you contribute is really, really important, particularly in this day and age where we're better connected, better informed, but further apart. And I think that, that face time with people is really important.
I'll make one more point. As I was listening to the Prime Minister speak about New Zealand and his perspective on sports, which I thought was quite thoughtful, I was reminded that at Georgetown we have a program of creating leaders out of our athletes, which is funded with a gift from a citizen of New Zealand. Who had how many kids at Georgetown, Jack? 7? 5.
Wow.
This is someone from New Zealand who's been a great donor to Georgetown with a great focus on leadership through sports.
That's a great concluding word. And David, I'll say thanks. I picked up the words compassion and respect in your final comments there, which of course are part of the Declaration of Principles. So I'm advised by our esteemed moderator that we're out of time for our prepared questions here. So I want to thank our 3 incredible panelists for their thoughts. We have now 5, we're going to open things up for another 5 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So thank you again to our group.
Right here, I think there's one.
And the mics are coming around here, so if you could just wait to get your mic. Thank you.
First question. First of all, great panel, great job, terrific, everyone. My name is Derek Higgins, a former employee of former commissioner at the NFL. So it's great to see Tags, as I can now call him, in the house. Question is for primarily for Paul and for Kathy, but open for David and for Val. In years past, we didn't see this importance of social impact and connection to humanity and impact driven by our sports leagues and major properties, teams, et cetera. Today, how do we actually push that to become part of the mission as opposed to just a PR tagline that everyone is not necessarily bought into as a real part of the organization, especially as Paul mentioned, leagues are in the process of iterating from what they used to be.
So, I'll start. I think that, and I think Commissioner Tagliabue hit it in his first remarks around how the access to platforms like social media have given the players individually a voice that, if you have 1 million or 10 million or even 20 million for some of our athletes' social media followers, you can actually have a voice on a socially conscious issue very quickly. And I'm blessed to be leading the WNBA, who I think even 5 years ago, I think, and Val would know this as obviously she launched the league as these women actually want to do this. They're not being asked to do it by the league. And in fact, I'd like to, because I think, to the small acts that Maya talked about, I'd like to focus our women on certain things, but I don't want as a league, head of a league to say you have to speak out on gun control or prison reform or opioid awareness or whatever the social issue of the day is or the socially divisive issue. So I think there is something here where I think it's just naturally evolved because, at least in our league, these women have natural platforms. I think owners of teams are also need to be part of this, and as they get measured on their social consciousness, and I know here in Washington there was an arena built in Ward 8 ahead of a renaissance of Ward 8. And I think it's going to prove, it's already proven a huge success because the Washington Mystics won the WNBA championship this year and had a great home court advantage, but to build in Ward 8 took courage by the owner, I think, in advance of a renaissance there. So I think the owners have to, the whole ecosystem has to be part of it. And I think it's just these women, at least that, are in the WNBA, this is what they want to do as part of their platform and mission. We didn't go tell them this needs to be part of your mission. It is part of their mission, especially, given where they grew up and where they came from.
David, did you have a comment on it?
Yeah, just, if I look at it in I guess, real terms, a vision of an organization goes so far. I think when you put in policies, so if you're trying to encourage athlete activism, if you're trying to encourage these elements, and I think it does start with a good vision, it does start with a good narrative, certainly from our own experience, by putting those words, peace, sustainability, and prosperity, community has focused our people will now hold us up to that quite, that's where we want to be held accountable in terms of what does success look like. So that's a starting place, but I think in putting policies down into place that enable athletes to be activists, enable athletes to get there, and I think what we will start to see over the course of the next 10 years is a move from sport engaging with social change as philanthropy and corporate social responsibility to probably shared value. And that's something I really encourage everywhere, where the focus is, the purpose is social change with profitability. So how we get that, and I think that'll be the next stage. But I think it's a very relevant question, but I think setting up good policies that empower and enable people to do versus hold them back is really necessary now.
I have a framework for thinking about Derek's question. What does a sports league look like when you add to its mission some social responsibility? I think you have to look at what I call the 4 Ps: preaching, protests, which includes boycotts, programs, and partnerships. Preaching is one thing. I'm not a preacher. Martin Luther King was the greatest. Congressman John Lewis is pretty good. Sports leagues are not going to achieve what Martin Luther King and John Lewis have achieved with preachers. Protests. They're important. They're very important. It's part of our culture. It's part of the First Amendment. It's part of what provokes society to be better. But protests don't always achieve what has to be achieved in terms of change. They may inspire change, but they don't produce change in many cases. Go back to the protests in Mexico City in the Olympics in 1968. Phenomenal actions by track and field athletes. What did it produce in the way of change? So my own focus is, with leagues and sports organizations, is on programs and partnerships. I already referred to RISE. That's about programs. The partnerships, I think, are key. Let's face it, there are organizations in America that have existed for 150 years working on issues of race and equality and treatment of ethnic groups and immigrants fairly. There are people like Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. This is not new, and athletes are new to the game, but they have to partner with people who have been professionals at this for decades and decades and decades. That comes to voting rights, comes to litigation, it comes to changing police community policies, sentencing guidelines. Look at what the Congress just did on sentencing. That took 10 years to get done. So you have to have programs and partnerships in addition to the preaching and the protest. But a league has got to be prepared to consider all of those opportunities.
One more question, perhaps? Yes, right here. Thank you.
Kevin Campbell with Georgetown Athletics. Quick question. You guys spoke in great depth about inspiring change through major sports. Inspiring change is easy to do when people are accepting change and when people want change, but what do you do when you're encountering those who are obstinate to change or changing course? Briefly, mainly targeted to David with Commonwealth Confederate Games.
You've got to create a safe place for courageous conversation. So, you have to understand how you can convene people, because if people aren't in the room, very little change happens. And so I can tell you, I've been some of the uncomfortable conversations around the Commonwealth have been best just put straight on the table and see where it falls. Some people may say that's reckless. Some people say that's transformative. But I think where you get to is if you consistently do that and you are courageous in those conversations and you do that with an ear of empathy and a mindset of compassion, with that you really do have the ability to respect all viewpoints and where people's starting point and where you want to get them to. But I really, I think there's really tangible ways of having those big conversations and addressing those, not through a hierarchy necessary. Send me a memo and I'll pass it up the food chain. I think long gone are those days. I'll send you I'll tweet it publicly and see how you respond. And that's what, and that shame or blame or that praise and glorification is forever out there. So we have to respect it.
Yeah,
And
maybe just adding a quick point around building trust. So one of the things I see when people are resistant to change, it's because you haven't built the trust in the early phase of your relationship building. And I always say you need to do some small things of symbolic value when you first become a leader to build trust. And then the bigger, harder things are easier to get done, including culture change. And I totally agree with David on courageous conversations. We called it a culture of courage at Deloitte. We didn't actually define it, so our people could think it was courage around diversity and inclusion, courage around innovation, courage around feeling entrepreneurial, courage around being a role model, whatever it was. But I think building that trust in the early phase of building a relationship, I think is the thing that works the best to ultimately get those that don't want to change on board.
David, good. Okay, I guess time's up. Thank you again to our group and to the audience. Thank you.